So welcome and good afternoon. I'd like to say hello and thank you for joining us today for Board Bright, which is NAO's quarterly board fundamentals training. My name is Jess Hampton. I'm the nonprofit education specialist here at NAO. And I'd also like to take a moment to introduce my colleague, Yannicka Marquardt, who will wave to you right now. Hi, Yanni. And Yanni will be taking care on the back end of any technical issues you might have, so you can directly chat her if you're having any difficulties. You can also always email us at training@nonprofitoregon.org, and we'd be happy to help you. But before we get started today, NAO's programming wouldn't be possible without the support of our funders and sponsors. So I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and thank them. So I'd like to thank Meyer Memorial Trust, the Ford Family Foundation, MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust, Collins Foundation, Oregon Community Foundation, the Kinsman Foundation, the Roundhouse Foundation, First Interstate Bank System Foundation, the Carpenter Foundation, Gordon Elwood Foundation, and the Johnson Charitable Trust. Additionally, we couldn't bring our programming to you without the generosity of our corporate sponsors. So join me in offering them thanks. I'd like to thank Columbia Bank, Nonstop Wellness, Kaiser Permanente, Bliss Sequoia, CFO Selections, McDonald Jacobs, Miller Nash, Nike, and Nonprofit Professionals NAO. A big thank you to all of the members who are joining us today. As you may know, if you are a member, nonprofits just get more with your membership. So if you're joining us today as a member, you know that you were able to send your entire board free of charge to this quarterly board roles and responsibilities training. So that's just one of the great benefits of being a member here at NAO. We are your state association. You also get price breaks on other webinars and network sessions that we host, where we're really hoping with those network sessions to come back to you very soon in person. You also get price breaks on our conferences, as well as any publications that we provide. And if you're not a member, I encourage you to check out the benefits of membership. You can contact Marie Manuel, who is our membership and partnerships manager, and you can email her at membership@nonprofitoregon.org. And something that we've recently begun to do is about every quarter, and I'm not certain of the next date. You can check our website. I apologize for that. But every quarter, we're hosting a membership orientation and informational session where Marie takes an hour and she talks to, and it's you can join free of charge. She talks to current members about what your benefits are that you may not even be aware of. And anyone who's just interested in membership can tune in as well to learn more about those benefits and what you would get in becoming an NAO member. So reach out to her at membership@nonprofitoregon.org. I'd also like to bring attention to the fact that we have something very exciting coming soon. So we have a workbook that you'll be able to find on our website very soon. It's part of this Board Bright series, and it's all around board management. So it's an accompaniment to what we are doing today. So this serves as an orientation to your legal and fiduciary roles and responsibilities as a board member. This workbook then, as an accompaniment to that, gives you exercises, tools, and self-assessments that you can use with your board in board meetings or at retreats and things like that. So do check out our website because that's coming very soon. I'd also like to bring your attention to some upcoming NAO sessions. On the 27th, well, I guess actually first thing in the morning, if you haven't signed up, we'll be getting together at 7:30 tomorrow morning. We'll be talking with Aaron Zolenkopf for engaging and empowering stakeholders with financial statements. So That's really going through your financial statements, the things that you should be looking for. So that'll be a great one. If you haven't signed up, sign up now. What you need to know about student loans and public service loan forgiveness, that's on Monday. And that is another one that we're providing free of charge to our members. And that is with Joanne DePaula, who works with Deb Northwest. She's an expert on public service loan forgiveness. And there are a lot of changes, as you may have seen in the news recently, about public service loan forgiveness and what you may have been denied for it previously, but you may be able to enroll now. So join us on Monday for that. On February 15th, we have fundraising event solutions with Samantha Swaim, and Sam Swaim will be talking all about kind of how events are evolving, whether you're thinking about going back to in-person or you're thinking about maybe a hybrid event. Sam will be going through all of that and kind of the latest in how we can do fundraising events safely and in the most engaging way possible. On February 17th, Zachary Stocks will be talking about Black exclusion in Oregon. So we really hope you can join us for that as well. Oh, sorry about that, folks. Before I shift into the presentation, I want to take a moment to talk about some housekeeping. So in your Zoom format, we're currently in meetings. So if you're not muted, please do mute yourself right now. We'll have an opportunity at the end of the presentation to ask questions. You can use the chat feature. Yanni will be taking a look at that, but also please, if possible, hold your questions until the end when we'll have probably about a half an hour to go over questions. Live transcription is on, and you may see that closed caption box. You can always toggle to turn that off if you find it distracting. And as always, we're going to share a recording of today's session, as well as the PowerPoint and any other relevant materials that I mentioned. And you'll be seeing that within the next couple of days. Certainly by Friday, you'll get that follow-up email. So with that, and without any further ado, let's shift in to talking about board fundamentals. On our agenda today, you can see we've kind of chunked these into 4 sections. First, we're going to talk about your individual roles and responsibilities as a board member. And then we're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of the collective. So once you walk into that boardroom, you become a collective governing body. And what does that look like? Then we'll talk about the structure and composition of the structure and composition of your board and what that should look like in best practice. And then finally, board management, whether you're an all volunteer-led organization or a staffed organization, what are some best practices around board management? And quickly, I see somehow, I think annotations or something got turned on. So very quickly, and I apologize for this, I'm going to shift away because you might see these blue lines on the screen. So I'm going to stop sharing for one moment, or I'm going to try to fix it in annotations. I apologize for that, folks. There we go. Okay. So if you're just joining us, I was mentioning to folks also that you can hold questions for the end because we will have hopefully about a half an hour to go over questions. And if we don't get to your question today, you can always reach out to me. And if I don't have the answer, I'll certainly get you to someone who does. Okay. So why a volunteer board of directors? So as most of you know, or maybe should know, that a nonprofit board or a nonprofit organization, because it's not privately owned, requires a volunteer board of directors. And on any nonprofit board of directors, you're really serving 3 key functions. The first is to represent the interests of the organization and its beneficiaries. So really working towards the bottom line of mission delivery. That is where in private business, we have the bottom line is profit. In nonprofit organizations, it's what we deliver in terms of our mission. So a little tip that I give to folks that I work with is making sure that your mission statement is posted clearly at all of your board meetings. In normal times, that would probably look like on a whiteboard or a chalkboard or a flip chart or something like that. You're simply writing out your mission statement where everyone can see it. Right now, that could mean, or it could be that you're putting that mission statement on your agenda and you recite it at the beginning of every board meeting. And what this does is it reminds people on your board what your mission is. It helps them to craft what we call an elevator pitch, which is a short speech on how they really tell people about what it is that your organization does. So it does that. And then additionally, if you're making any difficult decisions or really any decisions, you can point back to that mission statement and say, okay, as we make this decision, how will it impact our mission? And so you're really keeping that focus on your mission drive. Your second key function is collectively serving as the legal voice of the organization. A board can engage legal counsel, and legal counsel will always work at what is called at the pleasure of the board. You can certainly give if you have an executive director, the executive director can be given permission to speak to your attorney, but you are legally representing or you can find legal representation for your organization. And then finally, guiding the strategic direction of the organization. So a board of directors is really at that 30,000 foot level, whereas the staff is operationalizing that strategic direction. So let's dig deeper down into that. Individual board members are bound by legal and ethical duties of what are called care, loyalty, and obedience. And you may be familiar with a little red booklet that's called A Guide to Nonprofit Board Service in Oregon. We'll link that PDF and follow up to this little red booklet, but it's put out by the Department of Justice Charitable Activities section, which is the agency that oversees nonprofits in our state. So they put this out as kind of a little primer for board members, and they go into much more depth about these three duties: the duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience in that booklet. So take a look at that in the follow-up. But your duty of care really says that you're acting with common sense and using informed judgment when you're making a decision on behalf of the organization and its beneficiaries. So pointing back to that mission. Your duty of loyalty means you're making decisions that you believe to be in the best interest of the organization and that you're fair in all your dealings with the nonprofits. So you're really putting the organization's interests before your own personal interests. And that centers a lot around conflict of interest, which we're going to talk more about that policy a little later on. If you haven't adopted that policy within your own organization, it's an important one. So we'll dig more into that in just a bit. And then finally, your duty of obedience. And that says that you're faithful to that mission, of course. That's your guiding principle. That you're following the organization's governing documents, which would be your bylaws, which serve essentially as the organizational kind of constitution. You're following articles of incorporation, and then you're complying with any state and federal laws. And above all, that's making sure that you're filing your financial documents each year, both with the federal and state governments. So your 990 on one side and CT12, or 990 on the federal side, CT12 on the state side. So we talked a little bit about your individual roles, and you also have some individual responsibilities. So in order to perform your roles, you really have to take responsibility then in these three key areas. In active participation, this really means active management. And in practice, that means showing up to meetings prepared. And showing up to meetings prepared means, number one, showing up on time, right? And then reviewing any documents that you receive ahead of time. A lot of times, a lot of organizations have kind of board packets that they get ahead of a board meeting. So that might include financials, any program reports, stuff like that. And so you are coming to that board meeting having reviewed those documents, reviewing financials and reports, and coming ready with your questions. So you're actively participating. It also means at the board level, thinking about and putting in place any processes that would protect your organization from theft or mismanagement. So making sure you have proper financial controls in place, stuff like that. You're also responsible individually to make reasonable inquiries. So I talked about being prepared and ready to ask questions. That's also your legal duty to come with reasonable inquiry. So you're requesting and obtaining any necessary background information, any reports that might promote your informed decisions and votes. So you may have heard of ORS 65. So that is the set of laws that govern nonprofits in Oregon. And ORS 65 even includes provisions that protect directors' rights to inspect and ask and inquire about records. So it is your right to see almost any record of the organization. It is also your responsibility, if you need to engage services of a professional. So you might need outside expertise, thinking about an accountant or an attorney, like I mentioned earlier. And it's the board's right to ask, and at the org's expense, the responsibility to engage those outside professionals. And that's so, of course, you can make those informed decisions if you need to. So once you step into that boardroom, as I mentioned, you become a collective governing body. You're really the executive leadership of that organization, and you have distinct roles and responsibilities as that collective. Oops. Pardon me. So as a collective, the board guides the nonprofit forward and ensures success. So here are three key roles related to that. The board's role in governance focuses on two key areas. So achieving the organization's mission and ensuring the viability of the organization. You're adopting and practicing processes for making and implementing decisions that are in the best interest of the organization. And it's coming up again, and excuse me, I hate to belabor the point, but of course, the role of the individual we talked about is stewarding that mission. That also translates into the collective. So your stewardship role requires that you're keeping the organization focused on that mission and ensuring that organizational goals and strategies are going to make meaningful progress towards accomplishing that mission. And again, a good tip to use is the one I mentioned at the beginning, really clearly showing that mission statement at each meeting. Thirdly, you're an ambassador. So your organization's reputation is one of its most vital and valuable resources. So you have a responsibility to maintain the trust of your stakeholders, your beneficiaries, the folks that you serve, and the greater community at large. So you're serving as an ambassador, not just in the boardroom when you're making decisions, but also out there in public. Keep seeing these annotations keep coming on. So if you're accidentally pressing that annotate, or please don't press that annotate, it's usually disabled, but I'm seeing somehow it's coming on. Sorry about that, folks. Okay. So I want to bring this up, and you can reflect back on this when you take a look back at the PowerPoint, and if you view the presentation later with the recording. But this is a nice, as we're talking so much about mission, this is a nice activity that you might do with your board members to ask, is your organization mission centric? So take some time at a board meeting and have folks reflect on these questions, jot down responses, and just discuss them together. So you can use this as an activity at your next board meeting. Is your mission statement concise, and is it inspiring to stakeholders? Are your revenue sources in line with the nonprofit's mission and values? Are new board members passionate about the mission of the organization? And are you intentional in how you recruit new board members to be sure that they're passionate about your mission? And are you choosing the mission serving option over the easy one? Sometimes that can, sometimes you may find that you could generate revenue by doing this one program, but guess what? It's not maybe in line with your mission. So that's a place where you may really think about, is this going to serve our mission? And how do we forecast and plan for change to avoid the temptation to broaden or change your focus? And certainly if you're planning on changing or broadening the focus of your mission, that's a big conversation that the board needs to have. And it's up to the board to change the board's mission statement. Okay. So let's further talk about the responsibilities of the collective and kind of dig deeper into the more operational stuff. But some of the things the board is responsible for are your bylaws, your policies, and reports. So this is really going back to that governance role that you provide as the board of directors. You're ensuring the completion of governance tasks, such as amending bylaws if necessary. And again, your bylaws are the constitution of your organization. They talk about how you make decisions, what your quorum is. Sometimes they outline committee responsibilities. So if you haven't reviewed your bylaws in a while, I encourage you to do so. And certainly if you're a new board member, take a look at those, because those can really head off a lot of questions you might have around governance. A lot of those can be found in those bylaws, and it's up to the board to change those as necessary. The board is also reviewing organizational policies, which we'll talk more about the kind of the big policies that you'll need. I mentioned earlier conflict of interest. So that would be a policy that the board would review and adopt and would help to govern the organization. The board also approves budgets and establishes checks and balances. So those internal financial controls, that's up to the board as well. The board of directors also, it's your responsibility in terms of fiscal health and that the organization has adequate resources. So the board plays a role in fundraising. And additionally, that means approving major gifts. And of course we want major gifts. Of course the board would want to approve that, right? But sometimes we're thinking about, we are getting a gift, say, of a piece of real estate. Well, wait, once we start talking about that more, maybe accepting that gift might be maybe either not in line with our mission, or it may be too much work to take on. So those are things that the board would consider. Board also, in terms of fiscal health, is thinking about and authorizing any major borrowing. Say the organization has to take out a credit line, that's something that the board would evaluate and then authorize or not. And then board development. So you're planning and performing self-assessment. That means maybe annually the board is really looking internally at how you're doing business, how you're governing, and doing a self-assessment. Certainly at least every 3 years, you should be doing a board self-assessment. You're also identifying any areas of improvement, holding each other accountable for working effectively and efficiently. And another part of board development is looking for learning opportunities, like the one we're having right now today. So you're developing your board and continuously looking for ways to improve. The responsibility of the collective is also employing the chief executive. Typically, we call that our executive director if you're a staffed organization. And so the board of directors really oversees the hiring, the supervision, and potentially the termination of the executive director or chief executive if you don't call it the executive director. So talking a little bit more about that, the board staff relationship is crucial, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. In most nonprofits, the board of directors takes on the role of governance. So, and this is, of course, if you're staffed. If you're an all volunteer board of directors, you're likely, that's also what we call a working board because you're doing the work of the organization. But right now, we're just going to talk about if you are staffed. But the board of directors takes on that role of governance, and the management of the daily operations is the responsibility of the staff. So in simplest terms, the board of directors envisions the future of the organization at that 30,000 foot level. And the executive director then takes that and operationalizes the vision and delegates the work out to staff to accomplish that vision and those goals. So in working with an executive director, the board can expect them to manage day-to-day responsibilities of the organization. That means including managing staff, volunteers, overseeing program implementation, managing the budgets the budget that the board has approved, but also maintaining open lines of communication with the board, who is ultimately responsible as the executive leadership for the organization's success. The ED's expectations of the board. The executive director can expect the board, of course, to provide clear strategic direction. So if they're to operationalize that strategy, how are you being very clear about what that is? So that can look like strategic planning, things like that. They're approving reports and annual budgets in a timely manner. And the ED should expect accountability in performing the governance function and adequate supervision of their performance. And especially if you're a small organization, you may not, if you're not already having an annual evaluation of your executive director, you really should be, because without clear expectations, it's difficult to perform your role. So workflow is also important for trust and accountability, right? So the ED reports directly to the board, and because the board's authority is collective, is a collective volunteer role, it's important to, again, have those clear lines of communication. So let's talk about some important governance policies. And again, as I've mentioned, these are at the board level to discuss, adopt, and really enforce as policies. And these are the big four that we kind of see. Again, these are not legally required, but they're certainly encouraged for you to adopt by the charitable activities section, and they really create a safeguard for your board as you do business. The first is whistleblower. And so really that's if you have someone who raises an ethical concern against the organization, this policy guides the board, because that becomes a board level complaint. It guides the board through what you would do if you had a whistleblower. complaint. An anti-discrimination policy, that's one that prohibits unlawful discriminatory practices, and this guides the organization on how you would create that policy around anti-discrimination. Conflict of interest, we talked a little bit about that when we were talking about your duty of loyalty, and that protects you against self-dealing, which essentially means as a board member, you should never, you or this extends to your family members as well, should never financially benefit from your position as a board member. So this policy guides you through what you should do if a conflict of interest arises. And if you haven't, as a board, adopted this, this is the best first place to start, because it really protects you from any gray areas around financial conflict of interest. And then finally, document retention and destruction. And that just is simply, it goes through each document you might have, how long you should keep them, and when you should destroy them. And a lot of times when I ask the question of folks, how long should you keep your meeting minutes? Heck, I'll just ask the question now and put in the chat box. How long should we be keeping our meeting minutes? Go ahead and respond in the chat box. Forever, forever, forever. 5 years, 7 years, 7 years. All right. We've got a lot of different answers, but the answer is you should be keeping them forever, because they are your historical record. If anything were to come up about your organization, you can look back to your minutes and see who was present, what the conversation was about, what the vote was. So you're really supposed to be keeping those forever. And this document retention and destruction policy lines that out for you. And I will say most of the time what I hear is that 7 years. And I think that's probably because that's that typical IRS timeframe, but this document retention and destruction policy helps you to figure all of those things out and to safeguard you against getting rid of documents when you shouldn't. And I hear someone is, could you mute yourself if you aren't already? Thank you. Okay, so we'll shift now into, we've heard about the individual roles and responsibilities of board members, the roles and responsibilities of the collective of the board of directors. Now let's shift into talking about structure and composition of the nonprofit board. So size. ORS 65, which again is that set of laws that govern nonprofits in Oregon, it requires 3 board members for a public benefit corporation. That also requires 3 officer positions, which are president, secretary, and treasurer. And the same person can't hold all 3 offices. The same person can hold 2, but not all 3. And then remember, you must have at least 3 board members. So a lot of boards wonder, what the perfect board size is. What's the ideal number of directors? And the answer really depends on your size, scope, who you serve, your diversity goals. But these are the specifics that you might be aware of. So a bigger board may be able to better distribute the workload, but might struggle with accountability. And a smaller board might be more flexible, but then also more prone to burnout and lack of diversity of perspectives. And while the ideal board size is going to be unique to your organization, we typically find about 7 to 13 board members is sufficient and manageable. So those are just some things to think about. But certainly, as you see here on this slide, these are the basic requirements set out by ORS 65 in terms of the size of the board and the offices that are held. Excuse Excuse me. So we also have, let's go over our officer positions and what some typical duties that we see in terms of officers. This isn't going, and this is just at a glance, this isn't going to be true for all of your organizations, but again, these are just some typical duties. So president is presiding at meetings, signing documents and contracts if necessary, usually preparing the meeting agendas, and a lot of times that's done in partnership with the ED. And then the ED performance review. So the president, while the ED performance review is listed here under president, that certainly doesn't mean that the president is the only person who's doing that. That means that maybe the president is originating that process and then enlisting the help of the rest of the board to do that. But the president's making sure that that happens. The secretary is making sure those meetings are on the calendar. Folks are given notice. A lot of times we see it's like the third Thursday at 5:30 is our board meeting every month, something like that. But if you happen to have an executive session that's not scheduled, the secretary is letting you know. Secretary is maintaining meeting minutes. That may not mean that the secretary is taking the minutes. They might not be writing them down all the time. Even sometimes you may have a staff member who's taking the meeting minutes, so the secretary can interact more in that meeting, but certainly the secretary is making sure that the minutes are recorded accurately. And then the secretary might file corporate records. A treasurer usually will chair or at least be on the finance committee, making sure financial reports and tax forms are filed each year, and the annual budget and the annual audit are happening. So these are just some typical responsibilities that we see from our officers. Now let's shift into committees. Because speaking of spreading out the workload, committees can help boards be more productive. Committees do work at the discretion of the board, and generally organizations require that committees report on their progress at board meetings and present recommendations for board approval. So if the board delegates any authority to committees, all voting members must be directors. So the board has the authority to establish any number of committees and their size. And again, if you take a look at your bylaws, you may see, and all bylaws are different. There's really no exact framework around them. But you may, if you take a look, find that committees have been outlined, some of the responsibilities within those, the size of your committees. The board can eliminate committees if you're not getting work done, or maybe if they're ad hoc, it's just a one and done committee. Choosing if non-board members will be allowed to join, that's completely fine if you have folks on committees who aren't voting board members, but you really must have at least one voting board member on each committee. And knowing, I think this is important too, all this last point here, all voting members of committees exercising the authority of the board must be directors. So someone, let's say you have an advisory committee and you're bringing in folks from outside the organization because there's a public issue that you want to focus on. And so you're bringing content experts in from outside. Only they can't make decisions for your board. It's only those voting members. So they're bringing advisement back to the board to take that into consideration and then vote on. Oops. Let's take a look at some common committees. So we have our standing committees, which are those that are intended to exist in perpetuity. And these are just a couple listed here, but we usually see standing committees like our executive committee, finance, and fundraising. So an executive committee generally consists of board officers, is empowered by the board to take limited action on issues that may come up between board meetings. And the executive committee might also annually review things like personnel and compensation policies, and may provide that framework to annually assess the performance of the executive director. A standing committee that we usually see, one of the first committees a lot of times that are developed at nonprofits, are finance committee. So finance committee, again, is often chaired by the treasurer, generally works with the organizations. Maybe if you have a finance director, that finance director, even sometimes their bookkeeper or accountant, to really keep track of the organization's financial health. So you're reviewing financial reports ahead of the board meetings, ensuring that the organization has proper financial controls, and participating in the audit process, and sometimes delegating out responsibilities for that audit process. And then our fundraising committees. So fundraising committees are responsible for ensuring that the organization is conducting an adequate level of fundraising relative to the revenue needs of the organization. So do remember that one of your legal duties is the financial health of the organization. So this is kind of where the fundraising committee would come into play. Responsibilities generally include working with the staff to develop and implement maybe a fundraising plan, supporting staff in efforts to raise funds. This doesn't always mean that folks on a fundraising committee are going to be out there asking for the money, but there's certainly, or maybe that is you and you love to do that, and that's why you're serving on the fundraising committee, but you're certainly engaging in a way that's meaningful to raise funds. So that might be you are making phone calls to folks who donated over the last year, or writing thank you notes. So you're meaningfully engaging in ensuring the fiscal health of the organization through the fundraising committee. We also have ad hoc committees. So here are a couple: board development, audit, advocacy, and policy. And I'm so sorry, but I keep seeing this, the annotation, someone keeps clicking on that. So if you can, don't click on annotate. So some ad hoc, and ad hoc means that these committees are formed for a specific task or purpose, and then they're dissolved after that purpose is achieved. So sometimes we might see that as board development, and that could mean that you're responsible for tasks such as board succession planning and recruitment, or orienting new board members, conducting that annual board assessment. Audit, that might pop up at the end of the fiscal year, and but may also serve as a general fiduciary oversight role in annually reviewing financial risk and those financial controls. And then finally, you might have an advocacy and public policy committee. So we were talking a moment ago about single issue things popping up within your organization. So you might enact an ad hoc committee. And so at NAO, we really do believe that advocacy rights of nonprofits are vital to healthy communities. And as your state association, we're advocating at that state level for nonprofits across the state. So if not, you can add rich perspective to policy debates through something like an advocacy and public policy committee. Okay. You may have heard of something called an executive session. So those are times when the board finds that it's necessary to engage in confidential discussions, maybe around sensitive issues. So when that need arises, it's fully within the board's right to call for an executive session. And these are private meetings exclusive to board members. You may choose to extend an invitation to others as needed, but you don't have to, because usually we see that the executive director is invited to regular board meetings. An executive session, as an example, might be where the board needs to talk about the performance of the ED. So that might be sensitive. So you might have an executive session to do that. The thing about that is these decisions, although they're closed to visitors typically, although again, you can choose to extend an invitation, they must be recorded. Even outside of your board meeting, these executive sessions must be recorded as legal record. They can be stored separately, but they have to be kept in perpetuity also. So that's something to think about. Let's talk about recruitment and succession planning. So I've mentioned recruitment and succession planning a couple of times during the segment on structure and composition. So who is responsible for planning for transitions of leadership? The board, right? So a key aspect of organizational sustainability and sustainability of leadership is the succession planning. And a succession plan should be in constant application and include plans for addressing vacancies on the board, processes for prospecting and engaging candidates for the ED position, and outlining how your organization orients newly elected board members, and even what to do in the case of unexpected departures. And again, you might find some of this in your bylaws. You may have staggered recruitment of board members that kind of help to mitigate unexpected departures. So take a look there first. So there may become a time when it's important to invite a board member to not be on the board anymore. And that's also the responsibility of the board to welcome folks to step down if necessary. And it's important, although these conversations are hard, that the board should take action so that if someone needs to be welcomed to leave, so that it doesn't disrupt your organization's work or culture. So a lot of times, if you have a board member, say, who hasn't shown up in quite a while, certainly always inquire and ask them if there's something going on or something you might help with, or maybe it's that they're not in the right role for them. So maybe they're on the finance committee and that is just overwhelming. Maybe there's a place that they can plug in more and be more successful. So that's something to think about when before asking someone if they'd like to leave the board. But certainly if someone isn't able to show up and do the very, very critical work that you're doing, be there to make decisions on behalf of your organization, then it could be time for them to leave. It's important to take that decisive action before, morale becomes low. And we are into our fourth and final section, board management. And we'll talk about some best practices around board management and being more effective and efficient and successful there. So it's pretty common for board members to feel unsure of your role and maybe underprepared to fulfill your responsibilities because you've maybe never been properly oriented. And I have to say, I've worked with so many organizations, both small and large, that don't orient new board members. And I know both in my personal life, as someone who has served on many, many boards, as well as my professional life, the orientation can go a very, very long way in retention of board members and also providing folks with a foundation to really start to engage and interact and make decisions at their very first board meeting. So what can you do as far as a board orientation? This usually looks like an hour, maybe if you have an office space. Right now, most of us are virtual, so this might be a Zoom meeting, but you're taking an hour where the new board member or members are sitting down with maybe 2 or 3 current board members, certainly at least one. I would always say a lot of times it's the president who will help with this board orientation, then sometimes the executive director. You're getting a board notebook. So that's all of the documents you would need: bylaws, articles of incorporation, some previous financials, all of those things that you might go through to help answer any questions and clarify their roles, stuff like that. You're going to talk through those governing documents, talk about your strategic direction, your expectations of them, and then maybe even give them a tour, introduce them when it allows, that we're opened up and you can, or if your office is already open now, give them a tour and introduce them to staff so they have that connection to that day-to-day work that's being done within your organization. It also allows people to feel more directly connected to your mission because they've met the people who are doing it on the job. So don't forget orientation if you're not doing it now. And I mentioned the board document, or the board notebook. And I want to go over some documents that you might see in one of these board notebooks. And that simply looks like a 3-ring binder that, just one moment, having some computer issues. I'm so sorry about that. All right, board notebook. So this is a 3-ring binder, and it just includes a bunch of things that can get people started and understanding the background of your organization. And again, this is something that you're going to go through them with at their orientation. And you can reflect back on this PowerPoint to see what these documents are. So your governance documents, those are things like your bylaws, your articles, any policies you might have. So the 4 policies I talked about, you're going to have a copy of those inside this board notebook. Any meeting agendas and minutes that are important. And I typically think when, and I'm going to take this through to financial statements also. So when we're talking about including minutes and financials in a board notebook, think about 3 to 6 months back for those, whichever seems right for you. And that's so folks can get an understanding of the recent decisions you've made and the background on those decisions. And then the meeting schedule. So you want to have an outline of all of your upcoming meetings, and then maybe the committee meetings as well, a board contact list. And I would even say if you have an organizational chart, to include that. And sometimes it's great, especially in virtual times, to include pictures of people on that organizational chart, as well as their name. And if they're staff members, who they are, what staff they are in the organization. You might also include committee reports, committee rosters, and again, the schedule. Okay. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about meetings as we wrap up and start to take questions. So notice, it's vital, of course, that all board members receive adequate notice ahead of meetings, and that's in order to minimize the potential of not securing a quorum. That's a frequent issue we might have, or the minimum number. The quorum is the minimum number of voting members, of course. I will bring up too, once in a while, I hear nonprofits I work with say, well, yeah, we give notice in the paper also and let the public know. And when I ask why, most of the time they think it's because they have to. They think they have to give public notice. And I just want to tell you now, as a nonprofit organization, you are not required legally to give public notice of your meetings. And I think that maybe sometimes there's confusion with that because of public meeting notice laws with different government agencies, but that is, you're not legally bound to do that with nonprofit organizations. You may invite guests, but you certainly don't have to. Materials. So make sure you have that agenda and any program reports, financials, any of those things, at least 1 week in advance. Sometimes that's not always feasible, and that's okay. In best practice, we'd like to have all of these documents or that board packet at least 1 week in advance. but certainly at least 3 days in advance so folks can review that and be equipped to come with that reasonable inquiry that I talked about earlier. There's nothing set out legally except that you have to meet at least once a year as an organization. Of course, most of us meet monthly or at least quarterly as a board of directors, but you need the legal requirement is that you meet as often as needed for effective governance and to get necessary work done on behalf of your organization and its mission. As far as quorum, so it must be at least 1/3 of your board members. So at least 1/3 of your board members have to be present at your meeting to vote. That's legally, but your bylaws can specify more. But it has to be at least 1/3. So virtual meetings, we're all pretty familiar, right, with those at this point. But ORS 65 does say that a nonprofit can permit a director to participate in a meeting if all directors can simultaneously communicate with each other. So it's a meeting if you're on Zoom or Skype or telephone because you have the opportunity to simultaneously interact. And I want to bring that up because in a moment, I'm going to talk about voting by email because plenty of us are meeting virtually where maybe we hadn't at all before the pandemic, but what does that mean for how we vote? So I'll get to that in just a second, but as a preface to that, voting procedures, they generally follow this format. It's always going to be, or not always, it's usually some variation on Robert's rules. And again, go back to your bylaws and see what voting procedures are set out for you and follow those consistently. But this is typically what we see. A decision requires a vote, a motion is made, someone else seconds the motion, everyone has the opportunity to ask questions and discuss. And then once that discussion has ended, the board chair asks for a vote. So then, of course, each board member is casting a vote, whether that's yay or nay, and the result is recorded in the minutes. And now here's where I want to talk about voting by email. Because prior to January 2020, you pretty much weren't supposed to vote by email, and that's because you didn't have that opportunity for simultaneous discourse, like I was mentioning, where you do have that in things like Skype and Zoom. But January 2020, ORS 65 had changed because what they recognized was that a lot of folks were kind of voting by email anyway. So the law now states that you may email vote, but you have to follow these certain procedures. And again, look back to this PowerPoint and you can review these because this is directly from ORS 65. So all directors must provide an email address to you, and I'm saying to you, whether that's the president who's sending out the vote or whoever it is. You have to give email notice to all directors that describes the proposed action and when it's going to be effective. So when the action is going to go into practice. And you have to give folks at least 48 hours to vote. And they can change their vote at any time up to the deadline. And it's at least 48 hours, but you can give them, up to whenever, 72 hours. But in that time, they can email you back and say, I vote yay. And then 5 minutes before say, I vote nay. They can change their vote at any time until that deadline you've given them. And an affirmative vote of the majority of directors in office is needed to pass the proposed action, unless your bylaws require more. So here again, you need to take a look at your bylaws, but legally, it's a majority vote to pass an email vote. And then just like in your other minutes, the record of notice and the email vote and its results have to be kept in your minutes. And again, forever, right? Meeting minutes, as I've mentioned, you're required to keep them for the organizational history and for the duration of your organization. And you're required to record all actions taken by directors with or without a meeting. and committees, and to keep all those minutes as permanent records. So some of the things minutes should include are the name of the organization, of course, the date and time, the meeting location, was that at your office or maybe that was on Zoom, who was present, what the votes were. There's no specific rule regarding the level of detail that's necessary in recording conversations, but it's generally sufficient to summarize that a discussion on a particular topic was held, and maybe you might list a few key points made on the subject. And this is what must be recorded: the motion presented and its author, the second and who made it, and what the outcome was. Did it pass or fail? And then finally, related to the minutes, the board secretary is required to authorize an official copy after they've been approved. And this is one a lot of folks don't know. And this simply means that once the board has reviewed and adopted the minutes of the previous meeting, the secretary simply signs the copy, or maybe that's right now an electronic signature, but the secretary must sign it before it's filed away. Something to think about. We just have a couple of slides left, and I want to hit on board development. As I mentioned earlier, the board is responsible for their own development and enhancing your ability to fulfill your obligations to the organization. So in part, that means your own self-assessment that I also mentioned a bit earlier. So your organization's priorities and the board's role changes over time, and evaluating the effectiveness of your board alongside the needs of the organization is critical. We need to check in on that every so often. I think annually. A formal assessment should take place, like in best practice, we say 3 years, but again, I think it's important to do annually, especially as we see the landscape change so much more quickly in terms of maybe the services that we're providing. Internally, we've changed our staff. Fundraising may have changed, so you're able to assess your board better on an annual basis and your performance as a board of directors. And it's also important for boards to plan those ongoing opportunities for board members around things like training and education. And again, like today's session or other NAO offerings, strategic planning, things like that. And finally, we'll talk about retaining board members. Do you want to know the secret to retaining board members? It's directly related to their ability to see and feel their impact. And that's actually based on research. Most people join boards because they have a strong alignment to the mission and want to be a part of that. So they want to be able to feel the impact of what they're doing. So some things that you can do to make sure you're retaining board members are having effective and efficient meetings, starting and ending on time, making sure that all voices are heard in the room. You have maybe a set of group norms. So that's just a list of basic rules of engagement that you might post at every board meeting. So be respectful of others' opinions, be on time, reasonably inquire, things like that. You might consider having group norms. Actively engaging. And I see a lot when I work with boards now, especially in this virtual space that we're all in. We know we have to make so many critical decisions for our organizations at our board meetings. So we have that task. But there's this relationship piece where we're not able to maybe have those chats before we convene our board meeting with our other board members and get to know them personally. So we're kind of missing out on that relationship piece, which I also think goes a long way in retaining board members. So look for those opportunities for active engagement. Board I'm on, we always have a kind of silly question we answer at the top of every board meeting. So each of us reports out the answer to our question, and it's fun. We get to know each other a little bit, and it injects laughter. And so we're we're maintaining that task relationship balance, which can go a long way in retaining folks. How are they personally or maybe professionally developing in the organization? What are those ongoing opportunities for learning? Are there opportunities for them to advance in board leadership? Maybe they'd like to have an officer role. The connection to the organization. How are you engaging people in things that you do, inviting them to different programming opportunities or events so they see the direct impact of the mission? And then having regular check-ins. So as we evaluate our executive director, again, also evaluating ourselves, and then checking in with individual board members, like that board member who may have not shown up a couple of times, taking the time to just check in with them and see how they're doing. And again, as I said earlier, maybe the role that they're currently in isn't the one where they fit best, looking for opportunities for people to fit in where they'll be successful. And then looking for opportunities for feedback and improving folks' experiences. And with that, we've gone over a lot of information. So I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions. And I'm going to go back a little bit through what I see coming through in the chat. So, oh, and I see, Kate, you say you do the board book in shared cloud file now. Great. And I've neglected to mention, you can certainly have your board notebook in digital form or that 3-ring binder. I like it when I join a board and they ask, do you prefer it digitally or hard copy? Because I like the binder. Sometimes it's fun too with those notebooks. It includes stickers or merch or something. It's kind of fun. What should email voting procedures be documented in policies and procedures? No, because really it's outlined in ORS 65. It's that slide that I showed you, Jana, about email voting, those are the steps lined out in ORS 65. So it doesn't really need to be a separate policy. You can certainly have that and adopt it, but you don't really need to. I'm going to try and get to some more of these questions in the chat. It's hard to. Our organization's hoping to find alternative structures for communication other than Robert's rules. Do organizations use unique communication models? Yes. There is really no legal requirement in terms of how you're voting. Best practices say you need to be consistent no matter what that is. And I would really want a framework for how you're voting. And again, remaining consistent. I do see a number of boards enacting things like consensus building decision making, which of course does take more time because you're building consensus. So those are things to consider, the capacity that you have as a board when you're considering your decision-making model. Do you have more time, or what that might look like? But certainly it's up to your board culture, maybe what your mission is, and all of those things, how you want to make decisions. So if a staff or community member is on a committee, are they allowed to be a part of the decision-making, or only the directors who are on that committee? Any thoughts on having staff members? Oh my gosh, oops. Excuse me. So, okay, what I'll say to that is, first, no, if you're not a voting member of the board, you're not making decisions. What happens, let's say, for instance, a finance committee. We have, on the current board I'm on, sitting in on our committee is our executive director on the finance committee, as well as our bookkeeper. What we do in those finance committee meetings, that's along with 4 of us board members. We go over the financials. The bookkeeper helps to clarify questions we have. And then we take that to the board meeting and say, we've gone through the financials, here were our questions, here were the answers. Fully expecting that also the board, the other board members who are not in the finance committee, have also reviewed the financials, but really it's on us to go kind of fine tooth comb it. And then we vote as a board to adopt those financials or not, right? So it's always the committee is kind of giving advisement, and then the voting members of the board really decide what to do with that. And then, so I think the other question was about staff. So I hope that clarified that. You can have staff as it's appropriate, but know that they're not going to have final decision making on that. Okay. Cheryl Roberts, you're trying to renew your membership. Marie Manuel is on this call, so you can connect with her directly through the chat.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Susan's saying, can you say something about membership nonprofits? And Jessica, I see you raised your hand. I'm going to get to you next, Jessica Baker. Membership nonprofits, so that they're kind of 501c3s. You can check a box that says, do you have members? And that doesn't necessarily mean you're like a 501c6 membership organization. That means that you are like NAO. We have members, such as many of you here with us today, where we have to have an annual meeting. You may have joined us on Monday, where we open up a meeting once a year to all of our members to come together. Sometimes you may vote on a new slate of board members, and that's up to your members to do that. You're going over the previous year, what we're looking forward to the next year. But you're certainly, go ahead and send any more questions if you have them. And then Jessica Baker, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Thanks, Jess. I was trying to think of a way to type out this question, and then I was like, I'll just raise my hand. I wanted to ask about, because our board, I'm the ED for Very Little Theater here in Eugene. Our board is just transitioning from a working board to a governance board. I was just hired in November, their first full-time paid staff. It took them about 6 months to put together a code of conduct policy. And I wanted to find out a little bit more guidance about, how long do you think it should take for a board to put policy, like craft and ratify a policy? Because I feel like 6 months meeting every 2 weeks is too much time.
So that's a great question. There's no steadfast rule on this. And what I will say is, in the life cycle of an organization that's shifting from a working to a governance board, I think there is a lot of thoughtfulness required that goes into that, because that's a really big shift. So I think that's important that they took that time. But with a policy that isn't templatized, like the ones I mentioned, you can find those I don't know if I mentioned those 4 policies are on our resources page on our website, so you can get those templates. So that's a place to start. And so, for instance, with these policy templates on our website, you would take those, and the board would still need to look at that and change it and adapt it to meet your own needs. And that's fully within their responsibility or right and responsibility, and then adopt it, right? So I'd like to give you a better answer, but I'm certainly happy to connect with you offline. You can email me directly. Any of you can, if we don't get to your question today, and that's jhampton@nonprofitoregon.org. And I'll have Yanni include my email in the follow-up as well. And again, if I don't know the answer, I'm going to do my best to get you to someone who does. And I'm in Eugene too, so great work at Very Little Theater. Okay. Mary is asking, who approves the minutes and what is the process for approval? Well, the board approves the minutes. So once they've been submitted to, usually, we have our meeting, right? And let's say it's on a Thursday evening, and then on Monday, we receive an email back, says, hey, we've got the meeting minutes from last week posted, review them. And then at the next meeting, when we open it up, usually it's, do we have any discussion about the meeting minutes? Sometimes people might say, hey, I saw a typo, or hey, I remember something different. You have some discussion around that. And then the board votes on adopting the meeting minutes, right? And then once they're adopted, the secretary signs them. And that means they're kind of certified. And then, so Lisa's asking, what is the relationship between the board and their duties and the executive director? What is the primary difference between the board of directors' role in terms of fundraising and the executive director? And the executive director in raising funds? Is there a difference between a working board and a governance board in relation to my question? So we went over this a bit, and what I'll say is it is it's up to the board of directors. It's really your legal role and fiduciary responsibility to maintain the fiscal health of the organization, which means also fundraising. So if you're a working board, that likely means that your board of directors is doing that work. So maybe you have someone on the board who's writing some grants, or you're all writing an appeal. I've been on working boards before too, and we all write the end of year appeal letter together and those kind of things. But when you get to the point where you're staffed and you have someone who's an executive director, then maybe you have a fundraising committee made up of board members who help to strategize throughout the year about how you're going to fundraise. Whether that means, okay, in Q1, we want to do a big gala event. And in Q4, we're going to submit, names for you of folks to send out the appeal to, something like that. Or we're going to connect that committee is looking at ways that they can connect you to major donors, things like that. So it shifts to the executive director in a way where it's operationalized. And certainly I think the responsibility of fundraising can sometimes fall a lot on the executive director or other staff, say if you have development staff, if you're large enough to have that. But ultimately, the board of directors should also be engaging in that in some way. And as I said earlier, not everybody's going to be the go-to person as the one asking for money. By and large, my guess is you're looking at your board members, or if you're a board member, you might say, oh, I don't want to do that, right? We'll find other meaningful ways to engage in fundraising. Like I said, how are you making thank you calls or writing thank you notes? Are you sitting at the table of your event and engaging people at the table? Are you selling tickets to any event you have? Different meaningful ways to engage in that fundraising is important. And if I'm not getting to your question, go ahead and raise your hand. Is that, I see I think it's, and it's not the emoji, it's like the hand raise, but I think it's Issei, if I'm saying it right. Issei?
Yeah, it's a hard one. Isai.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah, so my question is I have a dilemma essentially for specifically the part where you said about the board self-development.
Mm-hmm.
Is that always kind of included into the budget that we would create, or is it more, I'm looking at more from an ethical perspective, that is it like typical for the board to include that in the budgeting, in the yearly budgeting meetings that we have?
I think it's a great question, and it can be. So it may be, for example, if you are an NAO member, you build the price of your membership into your yearly budget. And similarly to how you might put as a line item your professional development for staff, you might even, if you can, put in a line item for professional development for your board, or you might include them into one pot. But that can certainly go into your budget. So then you can plan for it. Yeah. And then board members also know, oh, wow, we have this opportunity to go to a couple of trainings a year to develop our skills as board members, which I think is also a great recruitment tool too. So
thank you.
You bet. Any other hand raises? Trying to go back through the chat. I'm not seeing anything maybe that I haven't captured, but I don't want to miss anything. Oh, I see Candy. Could you talk again about quorums? Define it. What must you have to do board business? Okay, great question. Quorum is the minimum amount of board members who need to be present to vote, who essentially, like you can get together at a board meeting, but if you don't make quorum, you don't get to really make any decisions. So it's that, again, that minimum number of people you have to have at a board meeting to make decisions. So that should be outlined in your bylaws. It should say, a lot of times it'll say, you know, the quorum is, you know, 5 people, or it's half plus 1 of whatever your board size is. I've seen a million different quorum sizes, but after you look at your bylaws, the legally, like I said, ORS 65 lines out that a quorum has to be at least 1/3 of your board members present to do business. That's to make decisions. But again, it could be more than that in your bylaws. I can't imagine it would ever be less than 1/3. Usually it's going to be like half, somewhere around half in your bylaws, but at least 1/3 is the legally required number. Are there any situations where it is appropriate for a board member to also be a staff member to do work beyond governance? No. And that is because typically no. Sure, there could be outliers or outlying situations. But if one of your staff members is on your board, imagine that creates a huge conflict of interest, because ultimately the board is making those high level decisions for the organization. And certainly if the staff member is the executive director, that is the board is the executive director's boss, right? So you kind of can't be both. You can, like I mentioned, an ED probably sits in on the meetings of a lot of your committees and things and helps to clarify and answer questions and things like that. Because again, they're doing that day-to-day operational work, but staff shouldn't be at a governance level. That's the board of directors' job. Any other questions?
I had a question.
You got it, Laura. Oh, hi, Laura. I think I'm going to talk to you in a little bit.
Oh, good. What if someone was a director on the board and then decided they only wanted to do half of the job that they had, and so quit that and took on part of the job as a staff? This is all volunteer, but then they want to come and be a visitor to the meeting all the time.
So you're saying someone was on the board, they left your board to become a staff, but want to go back to board meetings as a guest?
And think that they should be able to be a visitor all the time.
Well, that's up to the board. That's completely up to the discretion of the board, who they have as guests at board meetings. And if it doesn't make reasonable sense for that person to be present, especially since that might be a little bit of a gray area, since if they've been a long time board member, because they're no longer a voting member at that point. And especially if they're staff, I would say there should be some separation there and best practice. Yeah.
So if you say that you welcome visitors to your board meetings, I leave it to my discretion as a lead to say no, or just to say, not at this time.
Yeah, and what we usually see at board meetings is you can open them to visitors. They don't have to be. Again, it's at the board's discretion. So usually what that looks like if you have guests, it's like, as a program director, I would on a quarterly basis go to a board meeting and share out around what was going on that quarter for programs. I was a guest, but that was to share out, and then I would pop in and then pop out once I talked about that. So stuff like that is appropriate for staff, and certainly the executive directors usually sit in on the full time and should. That's important in the board meetings, but it's only up to the board and who they want to invite to attend.
So
outside of the voting members.
So posting it on your website that members, it's a membership organization, that members are welcome at board meetings is erroneous.
I'd have to see more what kind of member organization you are and what your bylaws say. You might find a lot of answers to these questions in your bylaws. So.
Thank you.
You bet. I wish I could have been more help there, but you can, again, please, any of you email me and we can dig deeper too if it's something that's maybe more sensitive you don't want to talk about here in the Zoom format. Okay, we've got a couple minutes. So I want to capture a couple of these questions. Renee, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. You think the board should also make their own determination on how, whether, viscosity guests participate in the board meeting? Absolutely true. Yes. And you can welcome guests to come. And if you have sensitive information or decision making you'll be sharing, a lot of times guests will come at the beginning, talk about something, and then thank you, and then they exit. That's okay too. And it's up to the board to decide how you want to do that. And this silly chat thing. I think, Amy, are there any situations where it's appropriate for a board member? I think I answered that one. To do work. Okay, well, what I'm gonna do here, folks, it is 4:30. Start and end on time. First pro tip, last pro tip. So with that, again, if you have any questions that I didn't get to, I'm gonna hang on the line because I see a couple people raise your hand, but I welcome anybody who can't stay on. I'll just take maybe 5 more minutes. But if you can't stay on, get to your evening. Have a great night. Thank you for joining us. We hope to see your colleagues here with us at the next Board Bright next quarter. And look for that workbook and look in your inbox for the follow-up materials coming to you. Thanks so much, everyone.